All right, we are live.
Welcome everyone to today's presentations. We're going to be discussing today a very interesting topic, an open systems approach to the future of United States universities. You know, some people describe universities as ivory towers, and that description really implies a level of insularity from the rest of the world. But the reality is that universities depend on their external environment, and universities must adapt to that environment in order to thrive. Today's discussion will focus on several external factors which affect universities, including international competition, state and federal policy and funding, technological innovations, and social movements. And I'm really pleased that we have three very, very distinguished guests with us today to have that discussion. Stephen Brent is a distinguished professor of sociology and public policy at the University of California at Riverside. And he's the director of the Colleges and Universities 2000 project. He's the author of 4 and the editor of 3 books, and has published more than 70 peer-reviewed articles and book chapters. He's written for the American Prospect, the Chronicle of Higher Education, the LA Review of Books, and the Washington Post, among other publications. His recent book, 2 Cheers for Higher Education, won honorable mention for the American Sociological Association's Pierre Bourdieu Prize, and was co-recipient of the Emory Elliott Book Prize, and was named one of the top 10 books on higher education in 2019 by Forbes. He's an elected fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science and the Sociological Research Association. Steve got his BA from the University of California, Berkeley, and his PhD in sociology from Harvard University. Our second speaker is Francisco Ramirez, who's a professor of education at Stanford University. His current research interests focus on the worldwide rationalization of university structures and processes, and on terms of inclusion issues as regard to gender and education. He has numerous recent publications on these topics. Francisco is also the co-editor of Universities as Agencies, Reputation and Professionalization. His work has contributed to the development of the world society perspective in the social sciences and in international comparative education. Francisco is the director of the Scandinavian Consortium for Organizational Studies at the Graduate School of Education at Berkeley. He's been a fellow at the Center for Advanced Studies of the Behavioral Sciences and at the Swedish Collegium for Advanced Studies. And our third speaker today, Roger Geiger, is a distinguished emeritus professor of higher education and was head of the higher education program for 10 years at Penn State University. He's written extensively on the history of American higher education, research universities, and higher education policy issues. His latest book, American Higher Education Since World War II, A History, has just been published by Princeton University Press. The preceding study, The History of American Higher Education, Learning and Culture from the Founding to World War II, published by Princeton University Press, received the Outstanding Publication Award for 2015 from Era Postsecondary Education. He's also an editor of the Future of the American Public Research University. He has published other highly influential books on higher education, and Roger received his PhD in history from the University of Michigan and held various appointments at Yale University's Institution for Social and Policy Studies before joining Penn State University. This is truly a distinguished group, and I'm really anxious to hear from them. But if you have questions, several of you sent in questions already, but if you have questions you'd like us to ask today's presenters, if you're on YouTube, you can ask those questions via the chat function on YouTube, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. So without further ado, let us now go to our first speaker, Francisco.
Thank you very much, George. Can I be heard?
Yes.
Okay. That great American philosopher Yogi Berra once said, or reputed to have said that predictions are really hard, especially about the future. So it's with some trepidation that I agree to be discussing the future of universities. And what I'd like to do today is three things. First, to give you a sense of what I mean by socially embedded organizational actors. I think of American universities relative to universities elsewhere as earlier and more extensively embedded in their societies, the open systems imagery, and also as much more functioning like organizational actors. So I'll say a few words about that. And then I want to suggest some challenges that the university is likely to face in the immediate future, centering on two things: pandemic and the rise of populisms. And then I'm going to, if I may, show you some graphs that indicate some further intensification of American universities as organizational actors. And I'll be looking at three things: development or institutional advancement offices, diversity or inclusion offices, and legal offices. So that's what I propose to do. And at any point, anyone should be able to jump in and ask questions or clarifications. So the first, if I may, is to to try to deconstruct a little bit of jargon. Okay. So what do I mean by socially embedded? I mean that they are in an environment in which they are facing multiple constituencies. Today we call those stakeholders, and they are not as state shielded as their counterparts in Europe or Asia historically were. So the American university has very early on been involved in a competitive field in which they face multiple stakeholders. As I'm fond of saying, if you look at the University of California and Stanford, from the standpoint of Europeans, those should be very different. One is public, one is private, but Stanford has Exxon and Berkeley has British Petroleum. Okay, so they both are looking for funds from both public and private sources. And the distinctions are a little less firm than they would be if you were looking at European or Asian universities. So that's the first point, that that these are socially embedded in our institutions, and that they're very much in a competitive field. They're competing for professors, they're competing for students, they're competing for resources. And that's in many ways the history of American higher education, at least from the standpoint of someone prone to generalizations like most sociologists are. Later, Roger will tell us the truth, okay? But for the moment, you'll have to endure me and then Steve. And the other thing to keep in mind is that they very early on are more organized. Christine Mousseline in France refers to the fact that French universities do not have administrative backbone. They continue to be loose associations of professors and students, whereas American universities early on began to look like organizational actors, not just bureaucracies, but organizational actors. And by that, I mean bounded entities with goals and strategies for attain those goals. I'm not going to put out the slide here, but in 1906 or 08, Charles Eliot made the famous statement that the universities needed to pursue funding, and that the best university in the world would be the university with the largest amount of free money. Okay, this was his, this is way back. In 1906, Harvard was not the wealthiest or best endowed university. By 1920, it is. And as I'm fond of telling Europeans, $35 million or $38 billion is not loose change. Okay, that's their endowment. So that's what I mean by socially embedded and organizational actors. The other thing to keep in mind is that while universities intensively compete with one another, they all have skin in the game as far as the legitimacy of higher education as a whole, or universities as a whole. So on the one hand, universities seek to present themselves as distinctive, because how else are you going to compete if you don't have the sense of portraying yourself as distinctive? And they're competing, but on the other hand, they're cooperating because they want to maintain the legitimacy of higher education as a whole. So there's the legitimacy of the specific university, but also the legitimacy of higher education as a whole. And this is kind of an interesting kind of issue, because on the one hand, you see them competing, but this is not like a business where you win if you become a monopoly, because partly all of them have skin in the game. And just as an aside, I've always thought of American higher education as America's secret social welfare program. Europeans have welfare states and they have safety nets. We have opportunity ladders, which may or may not work. But if everyone loses faith in higher education, we have a serious dilemma in the United States. So I will transition at this point to what I see as two challenges. And the challenges for specific universities, but also for higher education as a whole. The first, perhaps, obviously, is the pandemic. Competition will be intensified. Universities with less endowments are at risk of being extinguished. We have Mills College in the East Bay, and we have Notre Dame de l'Amour in the South Bay, and those are less well-endowed institutions that are in the process of rapidly shifting and figuring out what to do next. Okay, so my guess is we will have that happening, and in the net effect will be even greater inequality between the better endowed and the less well endowed institutions. I think that's going to be one impact of it. There will also be downsizing and cost cutting as an effort to survive, and that may rather directly threaten academic freedom. And that's one thing to keep in mind. And that allows me to segue to populism. Now, I was not aware until very recently that Idaho and Idaho universities were centers of Marxist thought and were promoting anti-American sentiment, but apparently that seems to be the case. I'm half tempted to be snide about this, and I sit and think, geez, I thought that's what Cal was for. But apparently Idaho is right there, okay? So we have a growth of populism. And while we all sort of cheerfully acknowledge populism from the right, there's a certain amount of populism from the left as well. So I think the authority of professors is much more fragile than it used to be. And I think the authority of universities is much more fragile than it used to be. I think we have virtual communities that are organized around the internet that challenge the authority of science, that challenge the authority of universities, and that challenge the authority of professors. So that I see as a real challenge. And I see it as threatened by both the left and the right, although we are almost more sensitive to the threats from the right. So should I pause at this point? I mean, Steve is grinning, so I'm not sure whether it means you're so wrong, cheeky, or should I move on? Does anybody have a sense?
Well, why don't you continue?
Okay. So how are universities responding to this? Well, they're responding to this in multiple ways, but in many ways, they're going back to what they've done before and moving in the direction of intensifying themselves as organizational actors. So if I may ask Gemma to put on some slides, if you'll bear with me, this will be brief. At the next slide, please. Okay, what I want is to give you a sense of the history of development office, a vulgar sense, I immediately confess, because all I'm doing is showing you the trend and not going into the specifics of different universities. Okay. But the development office is an American innovation. This is not simply about scrambling for funds to create a library or a lab. This is about endowment. This is about having a stable endowment. And in practice, that means you want lots of rivers of revenue flowing into an ever-expanding lake, okay? And you can see that this starts early, but by the time we come to the present, virtually every university has an endowment office. I will later, if I have time, just point out that I'm working with a national random sample of 235 universities and colleges. And of those, only one in 2017 did not have a standalone development office, and that was BYU, that does its fundraising through the Church of Latter-day Saints. So this is an amazing sort of story. Where in the social sciences can you say, if A, then B, and be taken seriously? You can do that in the natural sciences. Can't do that, but you can. If American University, then development office. By 2017, that is an axiomatic statement. Okay? So that's something to keep in mind. Charles Eliot's vision is now the vision of every university. You gotta have a development office. You gotta be thinking about fundraising. The second thing I want to show is the next slide. And that has to do with diversity-related offices. And that, again, is a challenge that the American university faced partly in the 60s and 70s. And now it is fairly institutionalized. Close to 80% have a standalone diversity office, sometimes called equity office, sometimes called inclusion. But this is in part going to become even more intense as universities compete for students that often were left behind, okay? And part of being an attractive university is not simply having really bright students, but having students that represent the American demographic situation, okay? So there's a lot of recruitment that goes on, not just in the interest of, quote, equity, but because it's more attractive to have a more diverse student body. It's more attractive to have a more diverse faculty body, okay? And this is fairly new and gets intensified. I want to point out that both with respect to development and diversity offices, if you don't know how to do this, there's a lot of consulting that can take place. And there's a lot of associations of development offices for higher education and diversity offices for higher education. So it's not just each individual university making an existential decision. They're also connected to other universities with ideas about best practices. And this is an overall organizational field that supports development offices and diversity offices, okay? So perennially fundraising, and increasingly in the last 40 or 50 years, concerned with issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion. So the next slide, if I may. This is an underestimation. I think we've discussed this off camera. Here, if you attributed the legal office to a system of universities, University of California as a whole, the numbers would be higher. But if you're looking for a standalone legal office within a particular university, the numbers are close to 50%. Okay, so this is a very conservative sort of imagery. And I think these things are related. The more you do fundraising, the more you have potential conflict of interest problems. And that increasingly makes you pay attention to legal issues. And the more you're dealing with issues of diversity and inclusion, you also have potential problems, okay? And both of these things, which come as a function of how embedded in their societies American universities are, in some ways naturally gives rise to legal offices. Okay? The last slide, and then I'm just gonna open up to whoever wants to. So the last slide is just telling you, here's what I am dealing with. I am doing together with a number of sort of gifted research assistants who are of course carrying me, I am looking at a national random sample stratified by region and type, public or private, and I'm looking at whether they have a development office, a diversity office, and a legal counsel from within. And I'm looking at this for a random sample, and then I'm adding the so-called Ivy Plus to it. As you might guess, when you have the Ivy Plus sample, they are even more intensely involved in this. So the imagery of the snake follows the head of the snake. So if you look at the Ivy Plus, and by the way, the University of California at Berkeley is part of the Ivy Plus, okay? So don't assume that these are just a bunch of private universities, okay? You're implicated in this, okay? And so you can see that it's almost 100% across for the Ivy Plus, it's less for the others. That's what I'm working on now, but I'm interested in thinking about what pushes this dynamic. And that's where I am. So I showed you the graphs. For those interested, I'm happy to show you a very rough draft of analysis of the diversity office. The question being, when is a university more likely to earlier adopt a diversity office? And it turns out it makes a difference whether you're dealing with the earlier time frame or whether you're dealing with a later time frame. But that's what I'm doing these days, and I think my 12 minutes are more than up.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Francisco. This is fascinating. Let's turn now to Steve for his presentation.
Thank you, George. As George indicated, the term open systems is a way of saying that forces in the environment shape the trajectory of organizations. And in the case of universities, of course, there are dozens of these. I'm going to focus on 4 that I think are most important. One is federal patronage, state budgets, technological opportunities, and social movements to incorporate underrepresented minorities. So sophisticated open systems approaches also look at the resistance structures within organizations and the incentives that managers have in terms of how they wish to direct the organizations. And so I will try to weave these themes in my 10 to 12 minutes talk today. Both the forces from the environment and the structures and incentives within the organization. So let's start with the environmental forces. Federal patronage is decisive for research and financial aid in American universities. Research expenditures from federal sources totaled about $40 billion in recent years, and financial aid about $100 billion if we count loan defaults. If enacted, the Biden infrastructure plan will bring another $50 billion into universities, including $40 billion for research infrastructure, half to go to minority serving institutions, and $50 million for NSF, if enacted, big if. Given international competition, it's likely that applied science will continue to grow more important, and that rivalries with Western Europe and especially China will loom large. The specific proposals for NSF initiatives on semiconductors and advanced computing are indicative. For a variety of reasons, the US academic research enterprise remains relatively strong, though it is not as dominant, of course, as it once was. By contrast, the financial aid system is faltering and will require fixing to maintain current or higher levels of enrollment. Undergraduate enrollments have been flat over the last decade, and they've declined in community colleges. More generally, expenses are going up faster than lower income students can keep up with them. And many students cannot afford to attend college or think they can't afford to attend college. And others are burdened by loan repayments early in their careers when they can least afford to pay back loans. So let's move to the second environmental force, state investments in public higher education systems. They've continued on a downward trajectory during the pandemic year. 21 states had declines in their funding for higher education, and many of the others were flat. And some of this is going to continue in the next year. Budgetary constraints in public universities will continue to encourage a focus on marketable fields, interdisciplinary collaborations, lean staffing, very large enrollments in high demand majors, and the employment of ever higher proportions of expendable teaching labor. The quality of undergraduate education will consequently continue to suffer. By contrast, there are reasons to be hopeful about technology, the third environmental force that I wish to discuss. Digital technologies will continue to amplify the output of university researchers, create new opportunities for collaboration, and provide the possibility for improved undergraduate education through adaptive learning systems and other innovations. At the same time, the evidence from this year suggests that students miss face-to-face socializing and find online classes lonely and alienating. They also miss student clubs and organizations, which they evaluate as very important to their college experience. Lower division students, especially men, underrepresented minorities, and students with low GPAs continue to fare poorly in a fully online environment, leading to at least the supposition that we aren't going to go entirely remote in the future. The intensifying drive towards social inclusion, the fourth environmental force that I want to talk about, brings a tremendous amount of new talent into the university, and it contributes, albeit modestly, to reducing inequalities that have plagued American society for 50+ years. At the same time, we can expect continued tensions between the priorities of social justice advocates who purport to represent the interests of minority communities and the commitments of many faculty members to traditional areas of study, traditional notions of academic freedom, and less socially inflected intellectual values. As I indicated, these environmental forces do not simply reshape institutions in their image. Instead, they are filtered through the departmental structures of academic life and managers' perceptions of the pressures and incentives in their environments. And now I will talk about those restraining forces or forces that also direct the way the environment affects the institutions. As long as academic departments control hiring and curriculum, they will have great influence over which subfields are supported, the extent of the shift toward applied work in the sciences, how technology is adopted, and how the tensions between social movements and traditional academic fields are resolved. The sciences and engineering departments are responsive, of course, to federal R&D priorities, but tensions continue to exist between a federal government increasingly interested in technological innovation and the traditional role of the university as a fount of basic research. The transformation of the sciences in implied directions is slowed by the recognition that no other institution has the time horizon that allows for the pursuit of basic research in the way that universities have that time horizon, and by investments of faculty in basic research topics. Meanwhile, the arts, humanities, and social sciences are becoming very heavily influenced by specializations related to diversity, equity, and inclusion, leading to conflicts between scholar activists and those whose work is in specializations not closely related to social justice concerns. Accommodation has been the norm in academia, but accommodation is less likely in steady state or contracting fields, like many of the arts, humanities, and social sciences. It is here where the struggles are intense or have been won by scholar activists. The incentives in the system as they are understood by university administrators also matter. These perceptions do not simply reflect in a mirror-like way the constraints and opportunities in the environment. Instead, they're influenced by administrators' backgrounds, experiences, and associations. A major difference exists between the client-centered incentives of struggling colleges and universities and the knowledge production incentives of the 35 or so top-level universities. The vitality of the sector may depend on how the managers of the dozens of universities in the middle balance client-serving and knowledge production interests. The common approach has been to expand undergraduate enrollments built along client-centered lines to subsidize faculty knowledge production. But bottom line considerations can put knowledge production at risk, and these considerations are more common where revenues are flat or falling. We can expect that some universities will focus on each one of the environmental forces I have highlighted. There will be interdisciplinary universities, entrepreneurial universities, technologically enabled universities, and broad access social justice oriented universities. A few will attempt to incorporate all of the leading trends into a new vision of the socially embedded university, which I define differently than Professor Ramirez, as universities committed to economic development, and the solution of social problems through interdisciplinary collaborations, enterprise models of external relationships, and broader access. We see considerable support for this conception of universities among students and faculty in professional programs, and also efforts to promote this model at places like Arizona State University. Now I'm going to conclude by just saying that likely paths are not necessarily desirable paths. And I'm going to close with a very brief overview of what a desirable path of development would look like. In the spirit of the times, my recommendations can be characterized as building back better. If adopted, they would lead to the creation of at least 2 or 3 more mega university complexes like those that now exist in Boston, Cambridge, and the San Francisco Bay Area. These geographical centers of knowledge production and venture capital are, in my view, essential to the future competitive position of the United States. Desirable reforms to financial aid would include the robust expansion of Pell Grants, something that did not make it into the Biden infrastructure plan, and the implementation of income contingent loan repayment so that students can pay back loans when they are better able to do so than at the beginning of their careers. A desirable path would also lead to focused attention on the improvement of undergraduate education, which is currently the weakest part of the university, the shift of many contingent instructors to permanent faculty lines based on the criterion of excellence in the classroom, and continued policies of social incorporation combined with the robust assertion of intellectual values against those who wish to reposition the arts, humanities, and social sciences more comprehensively around social justice priorities. These steps would put universities on a strong trajectory for the future. They are consistent with the open systems approach, but they direct environmental forces along the tracks of value rational institutional interests. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Steve. Very interesting. And Roger, you get to play cleanup. You get to finish the presentation.
Oh, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I will be sort of really addressing some policy issues and the crossing, which intersect with some of the things that Steve mentioned in a more nuanced way. But let me begin by just providing some perspective. I think there are now 4 sectors of American higher education with rather different missions, participants, and economics. First, there's the open sector consisting of public community colleges and regional state universities. They educate the largest number of students, and they've been doing rather poorly financially, as Steve mentioned. Second, there's a commercial sector that we don't usually talk about, which includes online behemoths like Southern New Hampshire University and the formerly for-profit institutions, which are like chameleons, changing their status and ownership at will. These institutions essentially supply higher education on demand. They have little capital, hire teachers as needed, and serve a broad range of students. Third, there's the gilded sector, high-priced, high-expenditure, selective private colleges and universities. They have been thriving, as we all know, especially at the most selective high end. But they comprise perhaps 3 to 6% of 4-year enrollments, according to Charles Klopfelter's data in Unequal Colleges. Finally, I think the research universities deserve to be recognized as a separate sector. They're distinguished by graduate students, postdocs, institutes. However, the vitality of these institutions depends upon research, externally funded research. Now, total spending for research has risen slowly in recent years, no thanks to the federal government. And as Steve said, there's no promises that the Biden proposals will pass. Federal support is the primary source of fundamental science and science capital. The feds funded 75% of academic science in the 1960s, 67% for a long time afterwards, and 60% before the Great Recession, and 55% today. That last 5% drop has largely been filled by universities' own funds. This is not a healthy picture. American science and academic research are joined at the hip. Our universities have been and will continue to be the principal source of our scientific preeminence. But we now face a challenge. China's latest national plan calls for a huge investment in R&D, specifically intended to surpass the US. This calls for an American response. But do we have to wait for a culture shock, like the Soviet launch of Sputnik in 1957? We need another Sputnik moment, sooner rather than later, to recharge a national commitment to science, innovation, global leadership, and universities. This will not be easy. The original Sputnik moment required extended presidential leadership, and it was sustained increases by congressional appropriations. Today, a proposed Endless Frontier Act sits in congressional committee, introduced last year by Senator Schumer, no less. I suppose it's been superseded by the latest Biden budget, but there's really no indication of the kind of political backing that would make something like that possible. However, I would argue that some kind of Sputnik moment is needed to bolster the preeminence of American science and research. And to my mind, the future of our universities will depend on furthering three fundamental characteristics: internationalism, separately organized research, and what we used to call technology transfer and might better be called knowledge exchange. These are not only inherent features of our universities, but they're also fundamental to our global advantage. First, internationalism. As China executes its national plan, it may well surpass the US in R&D spending, and it already has by some count in raw numbers of scientific papers. But it is unlikely to pass us in the quality of science. The quality weighted Nature Index still shows a substantial US lead, but China is advancing. Both China and the United States are part of a universal global science system. But the US is at the center of a worldwide scientific network. Unlike Chinese universities, American universities recruit and assimilate scientific talent from around the world. This is not only an advantage, it's a necessity. The stark fact is that the US does not produce anywhere near the amount of scientific talent that we need, not just for current needs, but to keep our comparative advantage. For PhDs, 37% of recent graduates were international students. That's up from 1/4 in the 1990s. In the physical sciences, 40% versus 30%. In engineering, 60% of current graduates, up from 50% in the 1990s. A while ago, I did a mini survey of assistant professors hired by the Penn State College of Science over 10 years. 1/2 were foreign born. And that's only part of the picture. Many of Penn State's leading scientists are foreign nationals, recruited to senior positions. Worldwide, science is becoming more interconnected, more collaborative, and more university-centered. By recent figures, 80% of STEM publications are collaborative, or excuse me, have at least 80% have at least one university author. Almost 1/4 of papers had international collaboration, and 40% of those had American authors. These are figures from David Baker's forthcoming book. American universities are central to international collaborative science. Second, the organization of science has generally been taken for granted in universities. For as long as we have had research universities, we have needed to have more researchers than teachers in certain areas. This has been accomplished with organized research units, centers and institutes, originally called ORUs at Berkeley. Integrating ORUs with the traditional departmental structure has always been a problem. Since 1980, research has expanded far more than enrollments, forcing a greater utilization of ORUs. Research universities have become more like matrices, with active researchers belonging to one or more departments and possibly several research units. This still poses a challenge of how to optimize the outputs of research and education. Throughout much of the world, and to some extent in the US, researchers and institutes have been largely separate from academic departments. I've witnessed this in Japan and China, where I believe it is more the rule than the exception. And in France and Germany, studies have found that the large role of non-university institutes has inhibited relative science productivity. Perhaps worse, separation removes some of the most accomplished researchers from working with advanced students. A Sputnik moment would induce an expansion of ORUs. Optimizing their contribution will require integrating them with academic departments. Penn State has created a particularly effective model for doing this. It has created overarching institutes for broad fields like life sciences and social sciences. These are separately funded by the VP for research. The institutes designate strategic research foci and invite academic departments to propose candidates for half-time, half-funded appointments. Departments get a half-price faculty member who starts with a strategic research focus and embedded support. Let me just give one example. An assistant professor in meteorology was recently profiled. She's an international hire who teaches programming to freshmen, statistics to graduate students, and pursues advanced research on machine learning in the Institute for Computational and Data Sciences. Teaching, research, and a valuable hire that would not have been possible without this system. Third, the US began a concerted emphasis on technology transfer in 1980. It has since become fully institutionalized across American universities. It's an old story. I wrote a book on this with Prezel Sa more than a decade ago. Jason Owen Smith has written one recently. The US has long been the international model, widely imitated, generally with less success, but there are a few points worth making. This process is driven by universities, not industry. Industry funding of academic research rose to only 4% in the 1980s and has since slid back to 3%. The key is university research that drives the advancement of basic sciences, the basic sciences that underlie future technologies and innovation. This seems to be understood and supported by the business community, by governors, and sometimes even by Congress, which restored the drastic funding cuts proposed by the Trump administration. Perhaps most important, all the stuff that falls under tech transfer is only one part of the nexus between research universities and activities in American society. I illustrated this in my book with an example from the University of South Florida. More than 1/4 of its research expenditures were neither for research nor training, but other. The other consisted of hundreds of mostly small transactions in which local governments, nonprofits, corporations, and foundations purchased university expertise. I think this is what David Frank and John Meyer meant when they recently wrote, essentially every institution in society now penetrates the university, presenting issues and agendas for resolution. They might have added, especially in the United States. Let me conclude with a perspective from human evolutionary biology, a theoretical perspective. Joseph Henrich, who professes this subject at Harvard, calls human knowledge our collective brain. In modern societies, growth in our collective brain depends on the number of people and their social connectedness at the knowledge frontier, the place at which individuals know enough to have a chance of making improvements on existing knowledge. Today, the knowledge frontier is at research universities, and the three processes I have emphasized each augment the number of people and especially their social connectedness. So in sum, American science needs something like a Sputnik moment to bolster the number of people working in American research universities, and universities need to organize them for maximal social connectedness. The alternative is stagnation, a shrinking of international ties, weakening the research enterprise, and fewer social benefits from university expertise. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Roger, and thank you so much, all of you, for what has been a series of fascinating presentations. And I know there's going to be a lot of questions, and we have a limited amount of time for them, but I'd like to throw out a few questions to you. One has to do with the future of public universities. Sputnik happened in 1957, and I was a student a few years after that, fortunately. But at the time that I was a student, and I suspect all of you were students, states funded almost all of the higher education costs for students in higher education. I know in California, when I was a student, it was essentially 100% of all funding for educational purposes came from the state of California. Today, again, using California as an example, but it characterizes the country, the public funding for universities is less than half. I think about 40% in California of the educational cost for funding comes from the state government, which means that the universities have gone from becoming fully publicly supported to being publicly augmented universities. And I sometimes wonder whether or not they will soon become state tolerated universities. So my question is, do universities need to prepare for a future where they have to be self-sufficient for their own funding? Or do you see the possibility of future upsurges in funding to kind of go back to the good old days of Sputnik?
Well, I could just say that I emphasize external research funding because basically that's what makes the difference between public research university and a regional university. It's the extra funding for quality comes from external research, and that's why there's a great deal of diversity in public research universities between those fields that are not funded and do not recruit top level students, and those that do.
So George, I can also say that this draws a bit on Roger's work, actually. Over the last 30 or 40 years, what we've seen is declines during recessionary periods, some increases when the economy's back on track, but usually not to the level that it was before. And that has been happening for quite a long time now. And we'll probably see some recovery now as well, assuming that there is the boom that everyone is expecting. But it's unlikely to ever get back to the glory days that you are talking about. And so we do have to prepare for a greater level of self-support through donations and tuition and other kinds of resources, and those are going to be especially important during recessionary periods, and if the past holds, which it's likely to do.
Great, thank you.
Roger,
Yeah, Francisco?
moment. So I'm wondering what would it take? A Chinese invasion of Taiwan? Would that be no, I'm serious. You're talking about a Sputnik moment, and I'm trying to figure out concretely what would that mean. It would not come from Russia. There's nothing Russia will do that will add up to a Sputnik moment. So that's a doomsday scenario, but you could imagine the invasion of Taiwan generating all kinds of federal interest in higher education. Again, mostly in science and technology.
Generate a lot of other things.
But this is, if you look at the report, the Gathering Storm, that's what it's all about. In some ways, it's reproduced here. I seriously doubt that we can actually get back to the days when, and this is a very shocking thing to people outside the United States, that public universities are publicly funded by public funds that constitute less than 50% of the budget. Friends at the University of Michigan say that Michigan is not just a state assisted university, but a state molested university. Meaning the rules and the regulations are there, but the resources less so. It's not a pretty picture.
And I would also buttress your point, Francisco, by reminding people that during the late 50s and during the 1960s, when the research budgets of organizations like the National Science Foundation were increasing dramatically, a lot of the justification for that was defense, was the support for the Defense Department, or basically the defense establishment in the U.S. So your point about the invasion of Taiwan is an interesting one.
I'm not advocating it, just pointing it out.
No, I think we all understand you're not advocating.
Well, the best case would be that the commercial competition would stimulate a greater attention to research rather than military competition.
So let me move on to another question. Just a few days ago, we had a presentation sponsored by the Center for Studies in Higher Education on the consolidation of universities, pointing out that many universities like Penn State, the University of Wisconsin, University of Alaska, have been undergoing consolidation as a way of addressing some of the external environmental pressures that they're under. Do you see this as a trend that's likely to continue, or do you see this as just an interesting reaction to the times that we're in today with coronavirus, et cetera?
Seems to be accelerating. The states that you mentioned, George, that's fairly recent. Those developments. It's so costly to, and some of in rural areas the population is declining, and so it's very hard to keep up the enrollments at some of these places, and it's a natural recourse to think about consolidation. So I think we're likely to see more of it in those areas where the population is declining, and we're likely to see new entities where the population is growing, though some of those new entities are going to be primarily online entities rather than built environments. So I think it's an accelerating process, it seems.
Well, yeah, I think it's driven by the factors that you mentioned earlier, Steve, but it's not affecting the research universities. In fact, the combining research universities with the non-research sectors is quite awkward. Something we live with at Penn State, but and something that they think they can do at Arizona State.
New American University.
That's right.
So I have a question that was sent in by somebody who was really directed at Roger, but any of you can respond. The question was, how much of the insufficiency of the production of researchers is quantitative instead of qualitative? A shortage of scientific labor was emphasized in the 1960s, but later turned into an overproduction of scientific labor. Jerome Wiesner later remarked that it was an insufficiency of a very narrow disciplines rather than an aggregate issue. Do you have comments on that, Roger?
Yes. Well, the expansion of the 1960s was necessary for this huge expansion of the higher education system, but the number of people we were training just kept expanding after the system stopped expanding. But since then, the number of PhDs was leveled off for decades, and since then, the only increase has basically come from international students and also somewhat from women and minorities. But the we really, as I tried to point out with the Penn State example, we've compensated for that by recruiting the best and the brightest from around the world, because when places like South America are not very good for doing science, and their best scientists are happy to come here, and that's true for many continents.
It does also raise it's kind of a depressing scenario, George, but the systems in China and India are getting better. And it may be the case that fewer people want to come and stay in the United States in the future. And we've been trying for a long time to build up the STEM pipelines and the Native American students studying STEM and then going into the professoriate with very limited success. And I think if people have ideas about how to stimulate that, that would be prudential, because we don't know how long this flow from China, India, and elsewhere will continue.
So several of you, or at least two of you, mentioned academic freedom challenges that we will be facing. I was going to ask whether you'd like to expand on those a little bit. I know that we have seen in recent years some state legislatures basically enacting legislation concerning curricula. We've seen issues that have arisen at universities that are facing financial difficulties. Would you like to say a little bit about what you see as the biggest challenges to academic freedom going forward?
Well, in some ways, Steve pointed to the fact that you can go back and talk about the McCarthy era. Those were challenges to academic freedom. You can go further back in time and realize the role Stanford played in leading to the American Association of University Professors, because one professor was arbitrarily fired. Okay, that's the Ross case. And then in the 60s and 70s, there were certainly threats to academic freedom. I was a doctoral student at Stanford, and I still remember a good colleague of Steve Breen carrying down a poster and saying, "I believe in free speech, but this is the wrong time to apply it." Okay, so there was a lot of excitement going on, and now we're getting it from exactly the two directions that I think Steve pointed out. On the one hand, conservative legislatures objecting to ethnic studies, objecting to women's studies, objecting to anything that sounds like a critical reading of American history. And on the other hand, Steve, I think, correctly refers to them as social justice advocates who think that anyone who is not a social justice advocate is in some ways an enemy. And my theory is that there's going to be a lot of self-censorship that doesn't quite make it to news, where people will be very careful about what they say, for fear that what they say could be construed as racism or sexism, in evaluating candidates for appointment, in evaluating candidates for tenure and promotion. I don't think that gets enough play, but I think it's happening, and I don't see a way out.
I don't have really too much to add to what Chiki said, but it is also the case that sometimes university branding interests can be a threat to academic freedom. If people say things that really hurt the image, sometimes universities get very concerned. Very occasionally donors get concerned, but it does happen. I think social stratification within academia also has an effect. The people who are kind of at the bottom of the teaching and instructional ladder, they have greater threats than tenured professors for sure, and they can be let go. And it's usually they're let go ostensibly for budgetary reasons, but sometimes it's in fact because of things they have written or said. So, and then with the issues of the legislatures that you mentioned, and with some of the social movement activists, I think it is a fraught time for academic freedom in universities now. And I think we're going to have to, people are going to have to resist these trends or these forces that are potentially jeopardizing academic freedom, because that is probably the most important freedom that we have in the university context, the most important thing that allows us to continue to make progress.
Well, we're almost out of time, but let me ask one final question, and that concerns internationalism, which I think all three of you have touched on in one way or another. And we've already alluded to the fact that there's a lot of concern about how many students from abroad would be interested in studying in the US. We're also seeing other trends, like some American universities opening branches abroad. So we're seeing a lot of change in that area. But given the challenges, are there ways that American universities should respond? Are there ways that we can be more appealing to foreign students, for example, that we should be thinking about within our American universities?
I think the Harvards and the Stanfords of this world are moving in the direction of treating foreign students as equal to American students, because they're providing scholarships, need-based scholarships, regardless of your citizenship. But again, that's easier to do if you have deep pockets and harder to do if you don't. So, you can look very progressive, but I'm not quite sure whether that is something that can be done across the board.
Well, Cheeky, I think you've written about the isomorphism of universities across the globe, and isn't that a factor as well?
Yeah, universities end up under very strong pressures to not look that distinctive. You see, Irvine started out as an experiment. They were not going to have departments, and it lasted for a long time. You see, Santa Cruz, as you know, did not give out grades. I'm not saying that giving grades is a problem. I'm just saying it's really hard to be distinctive, and yet distinctiveness often provides you with a niche. So there are some real tensions, and I think the tension is you gotta look like a university, but at the same time you gotta look distinctive.
Interesting point.
And it's a dilemma.
Well, thank you. Thank you all. This has been a really interesting discussion. I think we could have gone on for another hour, but I don't think any of us want to subject our audience to that. I want to thank those of you who tuned in and were able to watch this presentation. This has been an extremely interesting discussion, and I think it's a discussion that will not end anytime soon. This is going to be a continuing discussion for some years to come. So thank you all. This has been fascinating.
Thank you, George.